Stop believing everything you learned about Native Americans, because chances are, most of it was made up by a bunch of European philosophers who never even set foot in the Americas. And the worst part, this fake image they created has been screwing over indigenous people for hundreds of years. You know that image of the peaceful Native American living in perfect harmony with nature, the wise chief who speaks in profound riddles, and the spiritual warrior who never knew conflict until the evil Europeans showed up. Yeah, none of that is real. It's called the noble savage myth, and it's one of the most damaging stereotypes in history. Today we're going to rip apart this myth, show you where it actually came from, and explain why it's been so harmful to indigenous cultures. This is going to completely change how you think about Native American history. Here's the thing. When most people think about indigenous cultures before European contact, they picture this romanticized version of paradise, where everyone's living in peace with no war, no conflict, no problems. Just people holding hands with deer and speaking to the spirits. It sounds nice, right? But it's complete fiction, and this fiction was created by people who had never even met an indigenous person. The noble savage myth started in Europe during the 1500s and 1600s. European philosophers and writers were sitting in their fancy libraries, stressed out about their own societies, and they started imagining this perfect, innocent savage living in the wilderness. They weren't describing real people. They were creating a fantasy to criticize their own civilization. The term noble savage actually comes from a poem written by John Dryden in 1672. But the idea goes back even further to when Columbus first landed in the Americas. Columbus wrote back to Spain describing the indigenous people as innocent and childlike. He said they had no religion, no laws, no sense of property, making them sound like blank slates, pure and uncorrupted by civilization. But here's what Columbus conveniently left out. These societies had complex religious systems, detailed legal codes, and sophisticated economic structures that rivaled anything in Europe. The Aztec Empire had a legal system that would make modern lawyers jealous. They had courts, judges, and laws covering everything from property disputes to murder cases. The Inca Empire had a network of roads spanning thousands of miles, a complex system of record-keeping, and architectural achievements that still blow engineers' minds today. Their stonework was so precise you can't fit a knife blade between the blocks. The Iroquois Confederacy had a democratic system that actually influenced the American founding fathers. Benjamin Franklin studied their system when thinking about how to structure the new American government. But none of this fit the noble savage image. So it got conveniently ignored or downplayed. Tencame Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 1700s. This guy took the noble savage myth and ran with it like it was an Olympic sport. He wrote about how civilization corrupted humanity's natural goodness. He claimed that indigenous people lived in a state of natural freedom and equality before society ruined everything. But here's the kicker. Rousseau had never met a Native American in his entire life. He was sitting in France, drinking wine and making up theories about people he knew absolutely nothing about. Yet his ideas spread like wildfire across Europe and America. Suddenly, everyone was talking about the noble savage. Artists painted romantic images of indigenous warriors standing on cliffs, gazing at sunsets, looking all mystical and wise. Writers created stories about peaceful tribes living in perfect harmony with nature. Politicians and religious leaders used these images to justify their policies toward indigenous people. And here's where it gets really messed up. The noble savage myth actually made things worse for indigenous people in ways most people don't realize. Because when you put someone on a pedestal, you take away their humanity. You turn them into a symbol instead of treating them like actual human beings. If Native Americans were these perfect spiritual beings living in harmony with nature, then what happened when they didn't live up to that impossible image? What happened when they wanted to adapt to modern life? What happened when they wanted technology, education, or to participate in the modern economy? They were seen as losing their authenticity and betraying their heritage. They were told they weren't real Indians anymore. The myth created an impossible standard that no one could ever meet. Indigenous people were expected to be frozen in time, living exactly as they did hundreds of years ago. If they wanted to change or adapt to survive, they were accused of abandoning their culture. But here's the reality that the myth completely ignored. Indigenous societies were never static or unchanging like some museum exhibit. Before European contact, Native American tribes traded with each other, adopted new technologies, and constantly adapted to changing environments. They were innovative and dynamic, not stuck in some timeless past. The Comanche became master horse riders after horses were introduced to the Americas by Spanish colonists. They transformed their entire society around this new technology and became one of the most powerful tribes on the plains. The Navajo learned silversmithing and weaving techniques from Spanish colonists and made them their own. Today these crafts are considered traditional Navajo arts, but they actually came from cultural exchange. Plains tribes completely changed their way of life when they got access to horses in the 1600s and 1700s. Before horses, they were mostly farmers living in villages, but they adapted and became the buffalo hunting nomads we think of today. These weren't people stuck in the past, refusing to change. They were dynamic, adaptive cultures that changed and evolved like every other human society throughout history. But the noble savage myth didn't allow for this kind of complexity. It wanted indigenous people to be simple, pure, and unchanging. The myth also completely erased the reality of conflict and warfare in pre-contact America. Yes, Native American tribes fought wars with each other. They had political disputes. They competed for resources. They were human beings, not peaceful angels living in some Garden of Eden. The Aztecs built their empire through military conquest. The Iroquois fought brutal wars with neighboring tribes, and various groups competed for the best hunting grounds and trade routes. But admitting this reality would shatter the noble savage fantasy. So instead, people either denied these conflicts existed or blamed them entirely on European influence. Here's another problem with the myth. It made indigenous people seem primitive and simple, even while calling them noble. The underlying message was that these people were stuck in an earlier stage of human development. They were pure because they were basically children who hadn't grown up yet. This infantilization justified all kinds of horrible policies. If indigenous people were like children, then European colonizers could justify treating them like children who needed guidance and civilization. The noble savage myth was used to support the Indian boarding school system in America and Canada. The logic was that indigenous children needed to be civilized and educated to join modern society, stripped of their languages and cultures for their own good. It justified the reservation system that confined indigenous people to specific areas. The idea was to protect them from the corrupting influence of civilization, while also keeping them out of the way. It was used to deny indigenous people basic rights and autonomy. If they were noble savages, they couldn't possibly understand things like property ownership, contracts, or democratic participation. Even today, the myth continues to do damage in subtle ways. When people expect indigenous individuals to be spiritual guides or environmental experts just because of their heritage, that's the noble savage myth at work. When Hollywood casts indigenous characters as mystical wise elders who speak in cryptic prophecies, that's the myth. When people get upset that a Native American person drives a car or uses a smartphone, that's the myth telling them indigenous people should live in the past. The myth also erases the incredible diversity of indigenous cultures. There were hundreds of distinct tribes in North America alone, each with their own languages, customs, beliefs, and ways of life. The Inuit in the Arctic live completely differently from the Seminole in Florida. The Pueblo peoples of the Southwest had nothing in common with the Tlingit of Alaska, except being indigenous to the Americas. But the noble savage myth lumps them all together into one generic Indian stereotype. It ignores this rich diversity and treats all indigenous people as interchangeable. Let's talk about what these societies were actually like before contact. The Mississippian culture built massive earthwork mounds and had cities with populations in the tens of thousands. Cahokia, near modern-day St. Louis, was larger than London in the year 1250. It had a complex urban layout, specialized craftspeople, and long-distance trade networks stretching across the continent. The ancestral Pueblones built incredible cliff dwellings and developed sophisticated irrigation systems in the desert. They weren't just surviving in harmony with nature, they were engineering their environment to thrive. The Haudenosaunee had a complex political system called the Great Law of Peace. It included checks and balances, a council of leaders, and even had provisions for impeachment of leaders who abused their power. Northwest coast tribes like the Tlingit and Haida had hereditary nobility, slavery, and complex property rights. They carved massive totem poles and built huge cedar longhouses that could hold multiple families. None of this fits the simple, noble, savage image. These were complex societies, with hierarchies, laws, traditions, innovations, and yes, problems too. They had crime, they had inequality in some cases, they had political struggles. They were human societies with all the complexity that comes with that. The myth also ignores the incredible technological and scientific achievements of indigenous peoples. They domesticated crops like corn, potatoes, tomatoes, and chocolate that now feed the world. The agricultural techniques developed by indigenous peoples were so advanced that European colonists would have starved without copying them. Crop rotation, companion planting, and sustainable harvesting weren't invented by Europeans. Indigenous peoples had detailed knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and engineering. The Mayan calendar was more accurate than the European calendar of the same time period. They developed medicines that modern pharmaceutical companies still study today. Aspirin comes from willow bark, a remedy used by multiple indigenous cultures for pain relief. But the noble savage myth focuses only on the spiritual and mystical. It ignores the practical intelligence and innovation because that would make indigenous peoples seem too advanced, too civilized. The myth wants indigenous people to be wise about nature but ignorant about everything else. It's a way of keeping them in a box, separate from the progress of civilization. Here's what really gets me. The noble savage myth claims to honor indigenous peoples, but it actually denies them their full humanity. Real honor means acknowledging people as complex, flawed, innovative, and adaptive human beings. It means recognizing their achievements without romanticizing their lives or erasing their struggles. It means understanding that indigenous cultures were and are living, changing traditions, not museum pieces frozen in amber. It means letting indigenous people define themselves instead of forcing them into a stereotype created by outsiders. The damage of this myth is still playing out today. Indigenous peoples face poverty, health problems, and lack of opportunities, partly because of policies based on this romantic but ultimately dehumanizing stereotype. When people think of indigenous Americans as relics of the past rather than members of contemporary society, it's easier to ignore their modern needs and rights. When their cultures are seen as incompatible with modernity, it justifies leaving them behind. The truth is that indigenous cultures have always been adaptive and resilient. They've survived genocide, forced relocation, cultural suppression, and attempts to erase their identities. Today, indigenous peoples are artists, scientists, politicians, teachers, doctors, and everything else. They're keeping their traditions alive while also participating fully in modern society. They're not they're not mystical beings from another time. They're people, complex, diverse, talented people with rich cultural heritages and modern lives. The noble savage myth needs to die so that real indigenous voices can be heard, so that indigenous peoples can be seen as they actually are, not as some fantasy created centuries ago by people who never knew them. If you've learned something today, hit that subscribe button.